what's interesting is there's a lot of LDS scriptures. There's a lot of Bible scriptures, Hebrew Bible stuff, New Testament, but also LDS scriptures that talk about abundance, and that talk about how, there's more than enough for everybody. And God is full of all these gifts, and there's all this here. And that part we do tend to emphasize. We'll be like, yeah, there's all stuff. But then there's these, often you'll have a verse that says something like that, and that will immediately be followed by something that says, and if some of you take more and don't share it with others, you're going to burn in hell.
Yeah.
Like it'll say these like really, you're like, ooh, how dare, but there's a sense of outrage here. And again, if we keep it limited to an LDS context, you have a father with a bunch of children, and he's made a bunch of stuff and things for them, but some of them are keeping a bunch of it for themselves and not sharing it with the other ones, and that really makes God mad. And this is basic. But what's interesting is the ways that we ignore the second part and find ways to justify not sharing, and find ways to say, I earned it, I don't have to share. And so that would be a denial of grace.
It is time for another episode of the Cultural Hall. I don't want to Babe Ruth this episode, Justin, but I am pointing to the outfield, and I think that people are going to really enjoy the next little bit that we have to be able to talk about your upcoming book. I'm going to say it's that great, and we've only chatted for 45 seconds before we started recording. Is it hyperbole? Maybe. We'll see. We are talking about grace. And not just grace. The title of Justin's book is Grace or Money: Rediscovering the Gift of Grace in an Age of Greed. I'm so triggered. I can't wait to talk to you about this book. Welcome into the Cultural Hall, Justin.
Thanks for having me.
Now, let's set the table for people who don't or have never heard of you. Tell me a little bit about yourself. Where do you live? Are you a convert to the church? Are you married? Do you have kids? Let's just general stuff.
Yeah, so I was raised LDS, grew up in Arizona, served a mission in Mexico.
Okay.
Attended BYU and met my wife there, and then ended up doing graduate work out in Oregon, where I got my PhD, and then got a job currently in the Central Valley in California, in a town called Turlock. So it's a big agricultural valley out here, and we've been here for going on 10 years now.
And you're a professor?
Correct. Yeah. So I have a PhD, and I write books and profess stuff.
That is about my best way of introducing that. And then what specifically, as you teach, as you profess, as you write, what discipline would you put yourself in?
I was trained and still am in philosophy.
Mm-hmm.
Although some of the stuff we'll be talking about today will be very clear that I, for the last 5 years or so, have been really doing a lot of anthropology kinds of things. And then I do have a master's degree in sociology. So social sciences, philosophy, this sort of stuff.
Yeah, all the things. And something that I don't know that we do a good enough job here in the Cultural Hall talking around these things. I mean, certainly we've had philosophers on, or people who've studied philosophy, and we sort of engage that as much as we can. But I feel like it's a lot of things that people go, I think I sort of understand what someone that teaches philosophy might discuss. Or anthropology, we go, well, we know it's a store at the mall that's overpriced, and we kind of go, but we don't, we sort of know these words, but we don't really understand what they are, or what they would profess, or what they would spend their time doing. Break them down. I know that we'll get much deeper than this, but if I don't want to leave anyone behind in the dust. So when you say philosophy, when you say anthropology, let's go there.
So, philosophy, we have this idea of the philosopher as the Greek guy with a big beard wearing a toga and, pontificating about all sorts of strange things. In my case, particularly, what I teach, spend a lot of time thinking about, are just ethics.
Mm-hmm.
So questions of what is wrong or right, and how, what's the right way to act. So I teach bioethics, which is medical ethics. So, any sorts of questions that are, involved with medical things, although that's not my main interest.
Mm-hmm.
I also teach environmental ethics. and that's closer to what I'm very interested in. So questions of how do humans relate to the environment around us, and
Mm.
are we treating it well or not, and if not, why not? But really, ultimately, my interests are around the question of thoughtlessness,
Hmm.
by which I mean we're all thinking, but there's different kinds of thinking, and you can be thinking in one way and be doing a good job at that, but be thinking not in a different way, and that not thinking in certain ways can cause a lot of problems,
Sure.
right? So, we can be really good at making new technologies and using our brains to make new technologies, but we might be bad at questioning whether we should be making those technologies. This is the basic, Frankenstein or Jurassic Park
Hmm.
problem. Yeah. So is it smart does it take smarts to build a park full of dinosaurs? Yes. Should we build a park full of dinosaurs? Well, according to the movies, probably not.
Yeah.
And then anthropology, of course, is the study of humans, but specifically, it now generally means prehistoric humans. So humans from a long time ago, before we had writing. So we're talking probably 4,000 years or before.
Hmm.
And that's not how I originally got interested in I was interested in these ethical questions. But as I started studying anthropology, I started realizing that uh, there's a lot of really interesting implications, and that a lot of stories we tell ourselves about human history and about how we've got to where we're at are simply wrong, or they're mixed up in ways that are a problem. And the stuff we'll talk about is essentially me trying to think about LDS, what we think of as LDS issues or LDS topics
Hmm.
through these sorts of lenses.
Yeah. One of the things that I imagine, and tell me if I'm incorrect, but when you talk about like these things of like right or wrong, or these things of truth, very popular in our vernacular today is, well, that may be true for you, Justin, but my truth. And we just sort of throw that in, and it's like that can be your truth, but it's also wrong. Like you may think, how do we engage that in a day and in an age where it seemingly, oof, seems like we have let go of a truth or a right or a wrong, and we just go right for you, true for you. How do we engage in a society that largely believes, or at least professes to believe, that?
Yeah, so philosophers would call that relativism.
Hmm.
That's their word for the idea that the truth is relative to something. In the case, the examples you gave would be like an individualistic relativism,
Hmm.
that everyone sort of has their own truth. Now, I will say, like, it depends what we're talking about, right? Whether a sandwich is good or not is a kind of individual truth.
Sure.
But when it comes to what, Mormons would like to call eternal truths, or philosophers would want to call universal. There's different words we've used for this. Yeah, in general, I'd say I'll speak for philosophers in general. They get real grumpy and annoyed with the idea that truth can be relative, especially particularly individualistic relativism, or sometimes they'll call it atomistic relativism. Because look, if people can say all sorts of weird things, like you're pointing
Sure.
out. People will say crazy stuff, and if you don't accept that there is a truth, or that there are sort of legitimate ways to find truth, then you end up with all sorts of weird problems. And when the students say stuff like this, I'll always say, look, if someone says something, and I say, oh, I disagree, and then, so because you'll hear people like you're saying, they'll say, well, I don't think that's really true. That's not what I believe.
Hmm.
And then the question I always say is, well, is it okay for me to just punch them in the stomach and say, I think it's okay to punch whoever I want in the stomach. Therefore, no conversation can be had, and I just punch you in the stomach.
Sure.
You ultimately give up on the ability to do anything if you reject the idea that there is some sort of truth, or that everyone has whatever their own truth is. So philosophers generally feel like any sort of claim like that, especially if it's unsophisticated, is undermines itself.
Right.
And next thing you know, all we're doing is just punching each other and getting nowhere.
Or as I
So
like to call it, the 21st century.
yeah, yeah. Well, and it's not only that the claim is a bad one, it's also that it's not an ethical one either.
Hmm.
So it's false. The claim that that this sort of idea about truth is false, but it's also unethical.
Yeah.
But I should flag it ends up being a really complicated and interesting question. There are people that spend their whole careers asking questions about, like, what kinds of truth are there and what different ways are there of knowing truth. So I don't want to when some people are like say, well, I have my truth. Yeah, there are some places in which that's okay. So I just want to flag that that's an interesting and complicated question.
Sure. And I appreciate that. I want to just define a couple of things, and then I want to take a break, and then we'll get deep into the heart of this. So I would ask you to define two words, and you can do whichever one first. But as we sort of head up this book, I would love for you to define grace, and then I would love for you to define greed as you see it. So whichever one you care to go to first. I don't want to start talking about the intricacies and the intertwining, just defining them, and we'll come back and get into the meat of this whole thing in the second block.
Grace is a freely given gift, or I don't even, that might even be too much. We just say a gift. So when something is graceful, it's something that's full of this gift-like quality. And if we're strictly, in a religious setting, people, when they refer to grace, they tend to be referring to the gift of salvation that comes from Jesus and the atonement. So in a very narrow LDS sense, well, Christians too, when they say the word grace, that's what they mean.
Mm-hmm.
But as we'll talk about, I think that we need to go broader with that. There's more going on. So that is correct. That's the narrow sense.
Mm-hmm.
But then there's a broader sense that we can discuss in a second.
Okay.
And then for greed, again, how technical we want to be here.
Sure.
Aristotle uses the word pleonexia, which is his Greek word to describe greed. But the other tones of it would be addiction and an emphasis on the fact that greed can never be sated, or especially when he talks about pleonexia, he's especially worried about money.
Mm-hmm.
So you can never have enough money is what he's saying.
Mm-hmm.
And you can get caught up always searching for money, always trying to get more money. And it's particularly dangerous because Aristotle thinks that distracts from other things that are important in life, which for him, he says friendship.
Yeah.
Being with friends is one of the most important things of life. That's how he reads it. And then he would also say a healthy city. So having like a city where the city's doing well. And he would argue that money is so addicting and people get so obsessed with it that they end up losing their friends. They end up losing, the ability to have a good city. You could throw in family there. I mean, we've all heard this story, right? We know people that just get so caught up in trying to get richer and richer. And it's not even, you don't even have to be rich to be addicted to money, right? You can be poor and be struggling and
Sure.
still be obsessed with money. So in a very simple sense, greed is a dangerous addiction that can distract us from other things that really matter.
Is there parallels as you see it? And then I do want to take that break. Parallels as you see it when you say healthy city or community or family, like Zion immediately comes to my brain. Is that a fair application of that intertwining?
Yeah, certainly you could argue that greed is one of the greatest impediments to establishing Zion.
Yeah. Interesting. Okay. Well, let's take a break because I'm excited. We're going to dive headlong into this. We'll come back and do that in the second block of the Cultural Hall.
Faith shows up in the small everyday places. At Latter Day 3D Studio, we create detailed magnets from your favorite temple or powerful imagery of Christ emerging from the tomb. We also have modern ties designed to be worn to church or in the temple. Right now, listeners can take 15% off with code Cultural Hall as a thank you for supporting LDS creators. These pieces make meaningful gifts for baptisms, ordinations, or simple reminders of covenants at home, work, or worship. Visit LatterdAy3Dstudio.com and use code Cultural Hall again at checkout for an extra 15% off. Latter Day 3D Studio. Faith made tangible.
Here in the second block of the Cultural Hall, remember you can become a Patreon saint. Over 1,000 episodes published of the Cultural Hall. Encourage you to check them out. Everything from this kind of a topic to, I don't know, our weekly news episodes. We talk about all things the temples of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Or if there's just something that I'm like, hey, I've always been curious about this, I'll find someone, track them down, and then do an interview about that. So check that out. It's, you can find us on Patreon, patreon.com/The Cultural Hall. We ask that you make a donation if you like it. Why not? Put your money where your ears are. Patreon.com/The Cultural Hall. So, Justin, let's read it again. Grace or money, rediscovering the gift of grace in an age of greed. There is so much just in that. If we get, beyond the title of that, I think that we've done ourselves a great service. Tell me, where did the idea about this come from? Something you were struggling with?
Yeah, I mean, it came from a couple places. I mean, there's like personal examples, but then there's also, stuff I was reading and stuff I was interested in. Maybe let's start there. We can go to personal stuff if you want.
Great.
I mean, I mentioned earlier that I started reading anthropology, probably 5 or 6 years ago, because I was interested in it, but also because there have been all these really interesting discoveries in anthropology in the last 50 years that haven't sort of filtered down into popular culture. And that's unfortunate because they have really interesting implications.
Give me an
So
example of one. Yeah.
yeah, I'll start. So one of them is that we often have this story that we tell ourselves about, we'll use the word primitive humans
Mhm.
or the most ancient humans, hunter-gatherer groups.
Yeah.
And they're often characterized as really poor and dirty, and they don't have enough food, and they're sort of scrounging around and trying to figure out, where are they going to get enough food to eat. And they're often placed at the sort of bottom rung, the lowest ladder, the most primitive kinds of humans. The very word primitive, of course,
Mhm.
implies that they're the most backwards. And then what the story we tell ourselves is that humanity has been kind of improving and taking steps upwards ever since then.
Mhm.
And so it'll never be as bad as those groups. They've always sort of been treated as these backwards, primitive. Again, primitive is the right sort of word here.
Yeah.
But what's interesting is within the last 50 years, anthropologists have discovered there's some huge problems with this story. And in the 60s, there were anthropologists that were down in like South Africa, Namibia, in the desert there, and they were studying different groups that live in that area. And one of the things that they started doing was recording how they spent their time. Like, what did they actually do in a day? And to their surprise, they spent less time hunting and gathering than we do working.
Hmm.
So we spend, typical 8-hour day. They would spend much less time than that, and they were getting an equivalent or sometimes even greater, well, maybe not than us, but they were getting more than enough food. So they were not starving, they were not miserable. And then they did a lot of things that at first seem really weird, but make sense when you understand this. So for example, when anthropologists or, like sometimes aid workers would come to help them, I would say, do you need some help? Here's a bunch of food. And they would eat the food really quickly.
Mm-hmm.
And then they would save none of it. And these anthropologists were like, what's wrong with these people? Why aren't they saving this food? They just gobble it up and then leave. And this argument that I'm going to mention comes from a guy named Marshall Solomons, if anyone wants to hear more about him.
Yeah.
And he wrote an essay called The Original Affluence Society, in which he argued that they have enough food, and therefore, when you bring them a bunch of food, their attitude is not to save it because there's always more food.
Yeah.
Right? Why am I worried about, that I'm eating all the, whatever you're bringing me, I'm eating all the pizza. Shouldn't you save some of it for later? Well, no, because I happen to know that, it's an acorn season and there's plenty of acorns over there and there's plenty of fish in the river. So instead of being starving and miserable, these new accounts end up revealing people that they experience themselves as living in abundance. As there's food everywhere. You might have to move to go find it, but there's really not a reason to be worried because it's everywhere. You just got to know where to look and you got to know how to find it. And this also, of course, then is related to this issue of grace, which that food would have been seen as often coming from somebody. And many of these groups would have had multiple gods,
Mm-hmm.
right? But the earth that we live on is abundant and it's full of all these gifts. And so in that sense, there's a graceful aspect to life. There's more than enough food to go around. And we just have to manage it properly, which of course leads to the interesting second problem, which, we can get to in a second,
Mm-hmm.
which is, well, if there was so much food and there was such abundance, what happened, right?
Yes. So, I mean, without, I guess, kind of going there, because there are a couple things I want to pick up along the way. First of which being these stories about these, using your word, primitive folks and the situations that they're in, having not permeated general knowledge and or popular culture. Is it just because people aren't asking that question? Is it's not a way that, a victim mentality can continue? Like, why isn't that more well known?
Well, one of the reasons is because we like the story that we tell ourselves, which is a story of progress. that humans have been progressing over time. That we started off pretty bad, and then we invented agriculture, and things got better with agriculture, and then we, in the ancient, what philosophers would call the axial age, the period of ancient Greece and Rome. Then we had like art, and we were making all these new, discoveries. And then in modernity, we got even better. And that story, makes it sound like everything is just getting better and better and better.
Mm-hmm.
And it places us at the top. Like we are at the best time to be alive.
Right.
And we've got the best technologies. And on the one hand, we can take pride in that. Like it's, who wouldn't want to live here? But there's also a kind of, it creates a kind of identity for ourselves as advanced.
Mm-hmm.
Or, of course, as people started saying a couple hundred years ago, precisely to contrast ourselves with those who've gone before, they are primitive, they are ancient, we are modern,
mm-hmm.
right? And so we've created this story about ourselves that helps us feel good,
sure.
and that helps us feel safe. And it also implies that in the future, things will continue. They should, so far it's just gotten better, and therefore things should continue to get better. So there's a lot of comfort that we can take from this story. And if this is what we've all been taught, why in the world would you look back at these primitive peoples and try to glean anything from them? They're the least interesting of all.
Yeah.
Their lives were miserable. Let's why bother learning about them? Let's talk about the interesting stuff, which is new technologies that'll happen in the future.
It's notable to me you haven't used the word evolved. Is that tell me why?
Well, you're correct. We do use that language of evolved.
But you, in our conversation up to this point, have not used the word evolved, and I keep going, is he going to? Nope, he hasn't. I wonder if there is a stigma around like evolution or evolving that, maybe people within your discipline would push against, or that like puts one against another or something like that. How come?
There's two problems.
Okay.
First, evolution technically doesn't entail that things are getting better. Like in the Darwinian sense, when things evolve, it's the product of random mutations. In fact, this is why Darwin was, for many people considered like, anti-God.
Mm-hmm.
And they consider evolution to be something that's contrary to God, because it basically says stuff changes and there's no divine guidance. It's just random. And so that's one sense why I would be careful about using the word evolve. But anthropologists don't anymore use the word evolve, because they did early on. And they would say humankind has evolved. But the problem with that is it was incredibly racist. These were white Europeans going to study Black Africans and saying these people haven't evolved.
Mm-hmm.
And so not just the racist, as I've just been arguing, that view that everything's better now closes us off to understanding those groups and makes them seem uninteresting and unimportant. Mm-hmm. So most anthropologists will be careful. There are like evolutionary anthropologists, but they won't use the word evolve in the way we normally use evolve, with the connotations, problematic and potentially false connotations, that evolution means sort of progress. So they would be really hesitant about that and say, I don't know.
Is it also just the dissonance that we as humans have, where we like to put things in boxes and go old, bad, or not, whatever, and new aged? So I look at this from a very like inside baseball, and with you being a member of the church, you'll resonate with this, where we say, and you can remember the church saying, please don't stop saying this and attributing this, but it's like when I think they attribute it first to like President Hinckley, where it's like, when people will ask you the time in which you lived within the church, you'll say that you lived in the time of President Hinckley, and a hush will fall over the crowd. And, the main leadership of the church is like, guys, stop. No one ever said that. This is not a true thing. But we do like feeling like we're extra special now. We always want to be the more extra special now. And anything that if we feel like we are the extra special, we just go, oh, that was a pioneer problem. That's a turn of the century polygamy problem. That's a, 1930s depression problem. Is it just?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And it's not just that we are, distinguishing and feeling special about ourselves. I think we're also feeling hopeful about what we will be.
Mm.
Things will get better. We will be better. The problems will be fixed. So that whole narrative of progress ends up being convenient and, helps us feel good in multiple ways.
So do we just not engage the other side of that because it's harder and we're apathetic or lazy? Do we, or is it? Because to me, it makes sense that like learning about anything is always going to provide a richer sense of, you know, purpose or life or a greater knowledge just about a particular thing. But there are plenty of things, even though as I'm saying that out loud right now, that I go, I don't want to do that. I'm not taking the time to learn more about that.
Right. And again, I think it's really important to flag how these things get tied up in our self-identity.
Hmm.
Like, so one of the themes of one of the chapters of this book, which is actually built off a previous book that I wrote for an LDS audience that book is called Meritocracy Mingled with Scripture.
Mm,
And in that book, what I argue is one of the things that we really like and we really care a lot about is the idea that what we have, we've earned.
mm,
And it helps us feel good about ourselves. Like, I've worked hard, I've built this. And we use a lot, and this is not just Mormons, this is Americans and maybe a lot of modern people. We use a lot of language that implies that emphasizes how hard we've worked, that we've done it by ourselves. To touch on a very politically tinged word that we're self-reliant in the process.
hmm.
So but the problem is that's all simply patently false, right? I mean, we get help from our parents, we get help from our friends.
Sure.
The government builds the roads, the government pays for our public education. There's all these things that have helped us do whatever we've accomplished, but it's easy, many people want to downplay those things. And I think ultimately what they want is to feel good about themselves. So it's a moral thing. Like, I feel morally good about myself because I worked hard and because like you're saying, sometimes we have this weird thing we do as Mormons where we act like what you did in the previous life affected this life.
Yes.
And we can get into those details, and that ends up being weird and theological. But I mean, there were times in the past where people would be like, "Oh, if you're born in such and such a place, that's because you must not have been as righteous in the previous life." How
Sure.
doctrinal that is, I heard that stuff when I was younger, right?
Sure.
And people would say this sort of thing, like, if you were born in America, they want to take that as an indication. First of all, they're assuming that America is good and advanced and special. And then the fact that you're born here can be taken as a sign that you're a good person,
Hmm.
right? So there's a lot of things where it's convenient for us and it helps us feel good and it helps us feel, we take it as proof that God loves us
Hmm.
or that God thinks that we're special, even though I think ultimately these claims are false, or sometimes, worse, we may actually be, they're damaging,
Sure.
both for us and other people in terms of the pretensions involved about ourselves and about the ways that we're putting other people down to feel good about ourselves.
Yeah, yeah. So destructive. My mind instantly went to, and these can be sort of like grenade type conversations. But when we talk about like if we're spirits in heaven and then we choose to come down and for a long time with the priesthood ban, right? I'm born and I am a person of color, and then I can't have the priesthood just because I'm born as a person of color, and that's somehow less or inferior to people that were born elsewhere or people that looked like they were a person of color or not a person of color, and just all of this stuff that it's a fascinating way of looking at this, that to me, I just want to unravel it all and go, let's try again. The way that I've sort of looked at all this, can we just unwind the rope and there's all the threads and I'll make a rope again, but it feels like maybe I've built a rope of my own undoing or something.
Yeah, I think you're right. And then it affects race, it affects gender, it affects sexual orientation. There's lots of stories we're telling about why people are where they are and who is good or bad as a result of that.
Yeah. So then take me into the gift of grace in an age of greed.
Yeah, so if we start, what's interesting is there's a lot of LDS scriptures. There's a lot of Bible scriptures, Hebrew Bible stuff, New Testament, but also LDS scriptures that talk about abundance, and that talk about how, there is more than enough for everybody.
Mm-hmm.
And God is full of all these gifts, and there's all this here. And that part we do tend to emphasize. We'll be like, yeah, there's all stuff. But then there's these, often you'll have a verse that says something like that, and that will immediately be followed by something that says, And if some of you take more and don't share it with others, you're going to burn in hell.
Yeah.
Like it'll say these like really, you're like, ooh,
Yeah, got it.
how dare, but there's a sense of outrage here. And again, if we keep it limited to an LDS context, you have a father with a bunch of children, and he's made a bunch of stuff and things for them, but some of them are keeping a bunch of it for themselves and not sharing it with the other ones, and that really makes God mad.
Yeah.
And this is basic, but what's interesting is the ways that we ignore the second part and find ways to justify not sharing and find ways to say, I earned it, I don't have to share. And so that would be a denial of grace. So, and here you can see I'm talking obviously in a broader sense than the narrow sense of grace as salvation. In the book, I argue that there's an order of grace, that we can see this in the scriptures, but you can also see it in anthropologically described cultures, where they are experiencing themselves as living in a society full of abundance, but they're very aware that one of the potential problems is when some people start to take more for themselves, and when some people start to say that they are better than others for some reason or another, and then you end up with this trap where that abundance is lost because it's stolen by some, and then the rest are denied access to that abundance. And the irony is not just that, it's not just like, the wealthy people who steal this, however you want to articulate it, Pharaoh in Egypt. We get this image all throughout scriptures of the wealthy who are, drinking their fill and their pockets are full of gold. But what's interesting is once you break that order of grace and try to steal that abundance for you and share it, it's not only lost by the poor, but it's also lost by the rich because they can never get enough. Yeah. Right. So there, the Old Testament has various passages of talking about they're shoving money in their pockets, but there's holes in the pockets and the money's just falling out the other side. So, and this was something that, again, like I flagged earlier before the break, the Greeks were really worried about this. It's really present throughout the Bible. All these warnings about, look, once you start playing, think of them as different games with different rules. In the game of abundance and grace, there's more than enough. Therefore, we need to share. And we need to be on guard against anyone who would who would steal a disproportionate amount of that for themselves and who would then upset the sort of entire logic of society. So in one society, we share and we care. And another society, everyone has to do it for themselves. And you got to struggle and get ahead. And sometimes that even gets articulated in particular nasty versions where it's like survival of the fittest or the strongest are the ones that come out on top. And, the Bible is famous. Jesus is famous, but not just Jesus. LDS scriptures all sort of repeat this stuff. Sure. That we should be caring about the widow and the orphan. Sure. Right? It's not the greatness of a particular society is not how big a pyramids they have, as impressive as that may be, but whether the people on the bottom are being taken care of. And that attitude is the graceful, abundant attitude that says there's more than enough if we all preserve a certain way of doing things and share with each other. Versus, whatever you want. I called it the order of money in this book. Sure. You could talk about mammon. There's different words that get used scripturally, to describe, this sort of this very different way of organizing ourselves. And the modern version is capitalism, but there's older versions and there's lots of different versions. So there's not one way to do something that is the opposite of grace. I just think money is emblematic of a lot of the problems of this very different attitude, at least in terms of, what's so different from grace.
I want to get into that because you did bring up capitalism, and I know for some people, hang tight, everyone. We're having a conversation. We're going to get into it, and I fully have the anticipation that there will be people that will disagree with the conversation that we have, and I welcome disagreement. I welcome people saying, I don't know, I don't think so. I love having the conversation around it. So this is just a couple of us having a conversation around this. I would be curious, how much do you feel like a misunderstanding of doctrine plays into some of this? I think of prosperity doctrines where if I do A and B and C, it's fine that I own the world and God is just trying to prosper me. There seems to be some part of that. And something that we don't do within our LDS culture very well, I think that you can almost buy into a prosperity doctrine if you look at what you have as only stewarding it for God and then sort of redistributing within yourself. Meaning, I can be super successful, I can make the billions and dollars, billions and billions and billions, but so long as I'm stewarding it for God, I can both feel that God is blessing me in the billions of dollars and returning it by being a good steward. What say you?
There's a lot of ways to get into what to my response here. I'll limit it to the money point. We often want to think of money and of ways of earning money as innocent.
Mm-hmm.
And people will say money is just a tool.
Sure.
There's nothing inherently good or bad about money. In fact, there's some passages in the book where I talk about how it's really fascinating to me how people respond to that line from St. Paul, which is probably one of the most well-known lines in Scripture, both by Christians and non-Christians, where Paul says, the love of money is the root of all evil.
Mm-hmm.
What a remarkable passage, but I don't know if I've ever heard that quoted in an LDS context where there wasn't a felt need. Whoever was teaching the discussion almost immediately wanted to say, they want to flag, it's the love of money
mm-hmm.
and not money that's the problem.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting, like, why does someone feel the need to say that?
Mm-hmm.
If St. Paul had said, it's the love of cocaine, you could be like, well, it's not cocaine, it's actually the love of cocaine that's the problem. But the weird thing about saying that is money is clearly, and it's not just St. Paul, this is all throughout Scripture. There's a lot of anxiety, and it's not even limited to Scripture. If you look in the ancient world, they were very concerned about money and what money could do for a whole bunch of interesting reasons. And so you have, like, you could say basically, ever since money was invented, which is normally associated with, we think of coin, it's coin specifically, we're talking about the ancient Greeks, 600 BC. So we've only had money for 2,000 something years. And there was some kinds of money before that. They were like load-bearing interest, but really not, So money is a pretty new thing, and it really freaked people out when it was invented. They were really worried about it. And one of the things that's so remarkable about living in modern society is that we seem to have kind of forgotten about these things, and we're vaguely aware of it. When it comes to certain things, we will get pretty touchy about money.
Sure.
Like, when it comes to selling people or selling babies or
sure,
certain things, we're like, whoa, you've gone too far. But again, there's all these concerns about money in the ancient world because of they're worried that it brings in all this baggage with it. In other words, it's not a neutral tool.
Mm-hmm.
Money is one of the things that's weird about money is it's abstract, and therefore it seems to have potentially no limits. I mean, you can be addicted to food, but in a certain sense, you can only eat so much.
Sure.
And there's only so much point of, hoarding it because it'll go rotten. Whereas money, in an interesting way, doesn't rot. And especially when it's digital, has potentially no limit. And this is exactly what Aristotle says. He says money is unique and uniquely dangerous, more than other addicting things, because it can go infinite. Mm-hmm. And it becomes a kind of bad infinite where no matter how much you're getting, even if you've got way more money than you'll ever need in your whole life, people, and we have these super wealthy people in modern society, billionaires. And I always wonder, like, why not just stop? Like, why not go enjoy your time on a beach in Mexico?
Yeah.
And yet many of these individuals are driven by the need to get more and more money. So money is interesting because it's never been viewed as a neutral tool until very recently in human history. And we've had to tell some really weird stories about money and about being in a society that's full of money to hide that stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And so in a really basic sense, one of the things I'm doing is saying, hey, from the anthropological perspective and from the perspective of ancient philosophy and even early modern philosophy, they're all talking about money. They're all aware of many of these problems and the ethical implications. Why then aren't we? Yeah. Right? Or why do we take it to be a neutral tool that's not dangerous? And so, you can tell there's a lot we could say here. That's my attempt to give you a short version.
Yeah, so I guess my question goes is how do we, and let me just say this and then I'll quantify it. How do we not become the Texas of people with money, where it's like, I'm a sovereign nation and I don't believe in money, and you're just like, all right, crazy. Money has a value, whether positive, negative, this sort of neutral thing. How we can't opt out of a system. We live in a world wherein money is this thing. So how then do we engage responsibly? How then are we able to take what you're saying, look at it differently, and recognize, as those that have gone before us have learned some of these lessons around it? How are we able to do that and still be a part of the greater conversation and exchange, the interchange with money? It'd be easy if I could go, to your point, to a beach or to a community where money isn't the thing, and I'm able to just consecrate everything to people and we all care about each other, and that's the thing. That would maybe be easier in this respect, but practical or probable not.
Yeah, so we would have to distinguish radical change from practical change.
Okay.
And I think, and then we'd have to distinguish between material changes and changes of our sort of ideas.
Okay.
Right. And if I limit myself to changes about how we think about money, one of the things we need to stop doing is glorifying the rich.
Okay.
And I don't want to, people are going to say this sounds mean, but I'm just quoting scripture. The scriptures have lots of things to say about the rich, right? We're talking St. James, right? Jesus' brother says the wealthy are in big trouble. This is like you're going to burn in hell unless you give up your wealth or spread it around sort of comments. And you look at in the earlier book I wrote, there's all these quotes from early church fathers, Irenaeus, and anyway, there's a whole bunch of them, and Tertullian. And one of the things they're always harping on, and one of the things that they see as making Christianity unique, is Christianity's, about sharing. And if we want to get technical, there's these passages about having all things in common.
Sure.
There seems to be in the early church a strong awareness of this and a strong effort to avoid the trap of seeking to be wealthy, and a strong demand that those who are wealthy, as Jesus says, give it away, right?
Yeah.
Give your wealth away. You look at the cover of the book, of course, and the publisher chose to have, the young wealthy man who approaches Jesus and says, what do I do? And Jesus says, give up your wealth and follow me. And then he can't, right? He doesn't want it. So, I don't, we don't have a monastic order where we take vows of poverty, but we can certainly choose to, if we want to. Here's a sort of nice guy saying this.
Yeah.
C.S. Lewis, right? A very nice guy.
That's all right. Everyone agrees here. Yeah. Okay. We like him. Yeah.
And C.S. Lewis basically said, if you've got extra money, give it to the poor.
Sure.
Like, you don't need a giant house. You don't need all this extra stuff. People asked him, like, how much should we give? And he basically said, give away everything until you're pinched a little yourself. Right. And so there's, one of the things we can do, and this would be awfully helpful, is that those who are wealthy can do more to help. But when I say, this needs to change mentally. Okay, here's the meaner version now.
Yeah.
Wealth is bad. Big houses, if you live in a big house while other people are struggling, it's immoral, right? And it's not fair that one person is living high while another person's kids, who, children's no fault of their own, you want to blame them all you want. Take their kids that are born into a poor family, it's no fault of their own that they're in that situation. And it's simply not, so we have these remarkable inequalities in modern society, and they've existed in the past too. But I remember one time, I share this in the other book, the first book, we were in, elders quorum, and the teacher was talking about how in heaven, he was arguing, we will continue to have inequalities. And I raised my hand, I said, that's not like that. The scripture is very clear on this one. Yeah. And he said, I don't believe you. Show me a scripture that says this. And I quoted him, or I showed him D&C 49:20, which basically says the source of evil is that some people have more than another. And I said, my understanding has always been that in heaven, we're going to care about each other and that we're going to share. And that the elders was present, his comment was, or present, the teacher was, his comment was telling. He said, that wouldn't be fair. It wouldn't be fair if we were all equal, because the reason he's hoping the reason that some people are better off is because they've earned it. Right. And if we make everyone be equal, that's unfair to those who are pulling their weight and gives an unfair advantage to those who are poor and who ostensibly are not working hard enough. And again, that's a good example of the order of money, or we could call it the order of merit, meritocracy, this idea that everyone works hard and everyone sort of is where they're at because of how they've worked. And the interesting thing is, again, Jesus is very clear, like, Sermon on the Mount, don't worry about this stuff. Consider the lilies.
Mm-hmm.
A very famous line from Jesus. And Mormons get real nervous around that sort of stuff. We don't know how to deal with it. Like, what? Is he really saying that we shouldn't be, trying to work and do all this stuff? And, it sounds like this weird hippie Jesus who's just like, just chill out and be like the birds, man. But I think what's happening there is Jesus is pointing to the logic or the order of grace and saying there's more than enough. God will provide. God is providing. What you need to do is be wary of getting yourself caught up in this world where everything has to be earned and everything that I earn is mine. And if I've got more, it's an indication that I'm a good person, and that you've got less, it's an indication that you need to work less or that you need to work more. And I shouldn't. So there's a whole bunch of stories that we're telling ourselves that justify modern inequalities, that justify, there's a philosopher I like whose name is Adela Cortina. She's Spanish. And she coins the term aporophobia, which is the phobia, of course, fear or hatred. And oporo is poor. And she argues that the poor have become one of the groups that it is okay and widespread to institutionally discriminate against and to regularly commit hate crimes against. Like, think about how you'll have like some homeless person and people will do all sorts of terrible things to them, drive by and throw their soda on them and yell at them and do things that if you did that to someone of a different race or of a different culture, that would be considered a hate crime.
Yes.
But if it's done against a poor person, they deserve it. So there's a lot of complicated ideas here about how good it is to be rich and when I say good, I don't just mean good, I also mean morally good. Like, you're a good person because you're rich. And how bad it is to be bad and how morally bad you are if you are poor, which again, look at your Bible and it says something very different. And yet these ideas are pretty widespread in modern culture. And I hear them a lot over the pulpit.
Sure. Yeah. Let's take a break. I've got a few more questions. I'm surprised at how much our time has already gone by. And there's so much. And I know that there are things that people are going, but, and I know that we're not going to get into it. This may be a thing where we have you come back in the future, but I do have a couple of things I want to just pick at a little bit. We'll do that, plus ask the 3 questions we ask everyone who steps into the cultural hall. We'll get back to those in the third block. The turning of another year makes me start to think about how I have not done one of these ads for Best DJ in Utah in over a year. I'm sorry, everyone, but it means business is good. It means you should hire Best DJ in Utah. Why, that's me, and I even have people that work for me, trained by me, affordable, and travel all over. Literally all over, going to Florida this year, for instance. And this year means 2026, not this year, which could have been several years in the past, like we've been doing. You can go to bestdjinutah.com, or you can go and find us on our Google business page. It's Best DJ in Utah. You will see that as of the recording of this, almost 700 5-star reviews. Find out what so many listeners of the Cultural Hall have already found out. I'm great at parties. I'm great in your ear holes, but I'm also great at parties. So find out if I'm available for your date. We can help you out. Weddings, baptisms, bar mitzvahs, bat mitzvahs, funerals. I'll do a funeral. bestdjinutah.com. Here in the third block of the Cultural Hall, remember, you can always send us an email, contact@theculturalhall.com. Great book you're reading, great podcast you heard with someone in your ward said something, you said, I don't think that's quite right. Any sort of topic ideas, guest suggestions, or you can just say, I disagree with that Justin guy completely, or I agree with him completely. You can send that along. We love to get those. contact@theculturalhall.com. Best part is send them while you're thinking about it, because it will come into my inbox and I can address it when I want to, or maybe never address it, but I try and get back to everyone. Contact@theculturalhall.com. It would be easy, Justin, if everyone believed, as you've been talking about, right? People, again, we come back to the truth. That may be truth for you. They whether it's they need to say that out loud because they have a guilty conscience, or they realize they could have done more for people, etc. that they go, that may be true for you, but I don't know how we do it. Let me add on to that. It also would be easier if the church was like, if you make more than $100,000 a year, then and you have a child, maybe there's a way that they could structure it, and we can go, that's what rich is, that's what poor is, or you live in this state or that state, or this country or that country. But where it is left to our own devices, our own moral compass, there will always be people that feel differently. And then because people feel differently, will they go, well, if that guy's going to feel differently, then I want to feel differently. And then we're right back to the races trying to make more than the person next to us for whatever reason. My question to you is, after that long-winded explanation, so what? Yes, I tend to agree with most, if not all, of what you're saying. I could certainly do more. I could even walk out a practical example where when I was a much younger person, I thought, if I make this amount of money, that is where my happiness is going to come. And then I got to that amount of money, and you know who was no happier? Me. And then I was like, well, maybe I didn't adjust it for inflation. Maybe I need to make this amount of money. And I got to that thing, and I was like, nah, it ain't it either. I'm no happier, than this. There's studies about all that. So what? So what is the big question I'm asking? What do we do? How do we change? Do we need to? Is that not even what you're trying to get people to do? But all of this, the book, comes out early February. So what?
Yeah. Well, so here it'll help me if I flag that this is a sequel to this other book that I wrote.
Mm-hmm.
And the other book, we've already discussed this problem of aporophobia and the poor treatment of the poor. And it's been a couple of years since the book came out, and so I've had a chance to talk it over with various people and see their reactions. And one of the things that was really interesting to me in those discussions is that the very sort of aporophobia that I was worried about would play out in the responses to it.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, you can flag the problem, but people still felt like, well, it's still the poor problem. Why should I care about it?
Mm-hmm.
And so part of the reason for writing the second book, the Grace book now, and the last two chapters are essentially saying, well, wait a minute, this isn't just something that harms the poor, it also harms the wealthy, or really all of us,
mm-hmm.
right? And I framed that and discussed that in a way, and I chuckle a little bit here because I'm going to use a word that you probably never see in any other LDS text, which is the word BS.
Mm-hmm.
And I won't say the actual swear word because some people are touchy about it.
Sure.
Part of the reason I'm using this word is because it might not sound serious, but there are philosophers who argue that the phenomenon of BS is a really interesting and important phenomenon.
Okay.
And it's actually exactly what you were talking about earlier, when people sort of lie and don't tell the truth, or they say everyone has their own truth and weasel their way out of dealing with any truth claims. There's a philosopher named Harry Frankfurt who argued that is what BSing is. BSing is when you make an argument and you really don't care about the truth. You just make some argument because it's convenient or because you like it. Now, I would argue, and so the philosopher that I really love is a woman named Hannah Arendt, who was a German Jewish woman who actually had to flee Nazi Germany when the Nazis took over. But one of her first topic she was interested in was, if you're a Jewish woman living in Germany, how do you either sort of sell out on your Jewish identity and try to act German and fit in,
mm-hmm.
or do you embrace your Jewish identity, knowing that if some Nazi types come along, they might kill you? And so this problem of, do you assimilate to the system or do you resist it? When you're caught in a situation like that. And that her descriptions of this conundrum remind me very much of a conundrum that I would actually argue many of us are stuck in regarding the society of greed. And what I mean by that is we have a choice whether to participate in the society of greed or whether to resist it. And I think that when you participate in it, you have to sell yourself out to some degree.
Mm.
And actually, I would argue not just to some degree, a lot most of the time, right? So, I mean, when I talk about this with my students, I ask them, would you clean I'll say something that I think is unpleasant, like cleaning bathrooms at a subway station. Would you do that if it made $100,000? And they'll say, no. I'll say, what if you made 200? What if you made $500,000? And if you get up to a point like $1 million, all of a sudden they're all like, yep, I will do that terrible thing if you pay me enough. Which of course implies that they're willing to, you could call it overcoming or selling out their resistance to doing something. In this case, because it's gross, but you could also argue in situations where someone thinks something is bad, right? So you'll have companies that are making money in, ways that many of us would agree is ethically iffy. But you'll find sometimes people in high positions that are upstanding Christians, and they have to tell themselves a story about what they're doing. We had a guy in a ward once who was a lawyer for a cigarette company, right? And I don't think cigarettes are the most terrible thing ever, but people would occasionally ask him, like, do you feel weird being a lawyer defending cigarette companies when Mormons would say don't do that? And his response was, it's just a job. Yeah. He's trying to sort of make it sound okay. But the claim I make in this latter part of the book is that a lot of these things that we do, we want to treat as if they're morally neutral, and we don't pay attention to the moral damage they do to us. And when I say us, I mean normal and wealthy people, right? So you'll find people that are, they're wealthy, but in that process, they've had to, maybe get a bachelor's degree or advanced degrees in disciplines that they didn't like, right? They suffered for 4 years doing something they hated because they knew it would pay off later. Yeah. So we're taught, it's a weird thing. We're taught to sell out and do stuff we don't like. And we do it because it can be very profitable. But my worry would be that is morally damaging to our souls, that it corrodes our character to, constantly be doing things that we hate or selling out our moral commitments or fudging on them a little bit, because that's what one has to do to survive. I mean, we have different ways of describing how we get out of that. But the basic point I'm trying to make in that latter part is that, I don't think, the ways that a lot of people earn money are as morally neutral as we tend to just, portray them, right? I mean, let's take if you're a person that owns houses right now and is selling houses, and let's say you own multiple houses and you're selling. I have a friend who does this. So I have a friend who's quite wealthy now, and they own lots of houses. And one time, just sort of casually, I mentioned, you do know that I can't afford a house, I told him. And he was like, well, you just need to work harder. And I was like, it's going to be harder for me to work hard and earn and be able to afford a house if you're buying up all the houses. Right. And from his perspective, he's just buying houses. There's no harm intended. Right. But I was pointing out that part of the reason houses are high is that some companies are buying up all the houses. That makes it difficult for people on limited or even now normal incomes to be able to afford that. So a lot of activities, jobs that I think many of us take for granted, is this just what I do, I think are actually quite morally fraught in ways that are complex, but that we purposefully try not to think about. And that very act of not thinking about is itself something that's damaging to ourselves, right? To allow ourselves to be in denial or to deny ourselves the opportunity to think hard about the morality of what we're doing is very convenient, but I think is morally damaging to ourselves.
I'm going to tiptoe around this because I know that it'll be sensitive to people, but, in our worship inside temples, as we watch the video, there is very simple, almost comically simple, and I'm treading lightly, but at the exchange of essentially, there's a price for anything, or anything can be bought. And were I an irreverent, irresponsible person, maybe I've made a joke around some of that language that we see within the video in the temple, and we just sort of know it and we kind of accept it. But to me, that is, at least if I feel like if I'm understanding you correctly, it's like there is a price that is paid for most, if not all things, and we have sort of turned away from what that cost might be largely.
Well, it's exactly what you were talking about earlier about how there's certain stories that are convenient for us, and there's certain things that are inconvenient for us. So we accept the convenient story that, money, ways of earning money are innocent.
Mm-hmm.
And again, I think that's one of the primary messages of scripture is that none of this is innocent. And so, I mean, I guess you could argue that one of the things I'm trying to do is to wake us up to this conundrum where, I mean, I mentioned earlier that I worry about the problem of thoughtlessness.
Yeah.
And what's interesting about thoughtlessness is it's not necessarily malicious,
Sure.
right? I mean, I can harm somebody without intending to do so because I simply didn't realize that there were harmful effects yes, and there's lots of ways this can pan out, right?
Right.
But I think we see, and people get mad sometimes when you talk about these issues because they're like,
Sure.
well, no one's, these are not evil people who are trying to harm people. And I actually agree.
Mm-hmm.
I think a lot of times what you see people is these are people who are trying to do what they think is right. But like my friend who's buying up all the houses, I'm struggling to afford a house because of what you and others like you are doing. I'm not saying you're bad, but I'm saying this is making my life harder. Right. And although I would also say there are situations where what people are doing are bad, right?
Sure.
But of course, again, the problem is not just that, it's the effect it has on me as the person who's engaging in these activities.
Sure.
Right.
But
so I may have to sort of compromise myself or not think about something, and that's bad for me.
Yeah, but you get the very simple and just whatever argument, and I know our time is over, but I just want to throw this out there and see what you would say. The people that go, "What, you just want me to give you a house then, Justin? Is that what you want? I just need to give you a house? The American dream is the way the American dream is because I'm not anything special. I started a business. I was able to do it. Anyone's able to do it." So what do we, in a very short, I know I just pulled the pin on that grenade and said, hey, take that for 30 seconds. But I would be curious to those that just sort of reject this, what they feel like maybe lefty message or whatever the thing is. Like, how do we say, yeah, maybe not. Maybe don't make it that simple.
Well, or maybe keep it that simple. If you've got two houses and someone needs a house, why not let them have the house or let them live in the house? I don't know. I don't know if it's that hard.
Yeah, I am excited to see how people respond to this episode. I think it is a rich conversation and one that, if nothing else taken away from our time, I like the idea of being thoughtful as opposed to thoughtless. And I think that we may end up doing the same thing as we were going to do before, but I think that there is merit in going, pause. What happens if I do this? How will this affect me, my family, others around me? What does this actually mean that this is happening? And so I appreciate our time as far as that goes. There are 3 questions that we ask everyone who steps into the Cultural Hall. I'll ask those of you now. The first question is do you have a calling right now? And if so, what is it?
Do not have a calling right now. Nope.
If you could pick a calling for yourself, either one that exists or make one up, what would you pick?
Gospel doctrine teacher.
Okay. What year would you teach?
Oh, what particular book?
Yeah. Like what book?
Location?
What would you teach? Yeah. What would you teach?
Oh, that's a good question. I think they're all quite interesting. I mean, I would be tempted to say Book of Mormon, but when I'm interested in all this anthropology, maybe I want to do Old Testament.
Yeah. Yeah. You got to adjust it. We call it the Hebrew Bible now, apparently. That's the hot thing to call the Old Testament within the church. It's an inside thing with us in the Cultural Hall. Everyone's calling it the Hebrew Bible, and we're like, we're all talking about the Old Testament. And they're like, yeah. We don't call it that anymore. And it's like, okay, Hebrew Bible? Yeah, the Old Testament. Then the final question, we ask you to interpret however you would like, but the question remains, what is your favorite part of your faith?
Oh, that's a good question. My favorite part of, when you say my faith, you mean the church?
However you interpret it.
One of the things I love about, I'll keep it here then to the church. I'll interpret it that way. Is I love these stories of Fourth Nephi, where we have a model of a society that, according to Fourth Nephi, is the happiest people that's ever existed, in the history of the world. And that we have multiple sort of examples of this, City of Enoch and these other examples. And I love those models, even if you take it in a non-LDS context, the idea that you can have a community where people are caring and loving and, sharing all things in common and not getting caught up in fancy jewelry and all the stuff that's flagged in Fourth Nephi. I love that image of a alternative. And that sort of thing for me gives me hope, because it's probably clear by now, I'm not very comfortable with the way things are currently going.
Yeah. I have serious questions for people who are like, yeah, it's pretty good. Like if you look at everything, even if you just take a small, like choose whatever kind of thing. If you're like, yeah, no, I think that's how God wants it. I just sort of go, I don't know. Are we talking about the same Heavenly Father, you and I? Because I'm not so sure. People can check it out, pre-order or order, depending on when they are listening to this. The book, it's called Grace or Money, Rediscovering the Gift of Grace in an Age of Greed. Find a link for it in the show notes and go and check it out. Justin, I appreciate your time. A shout out to the folks over at Coford Books, Trent, and the team for connecting us together to be able to have this conversation. You'd be open to coming back and having a further conversation if people are like, well, what does Justin have to say? Would you be willing?
Of course.
Good. I feel like you would be, and I appreciate the discussion around it. We hope that this episode has nourished and strengthened your body, that if you are not healthy enough to listen this week, that you'll be healthy enough to listen next week, and that when the time comes, you will be able to travel home in safety. In the meantime, go Tar Heels, Chris at Alpine Lakes Travel, The Tiger with a U, Debbie Wanless and Chocolate Cake Bites Podcast, and Latter Day 3D Studio. We'll be saving a seat for you on the back row of the Cultural Hall.
Save me a seat, it's sure to be neat on the back row. We really gotta go on the Cultural Hall show.